Welcome to Speaking of Athletes. I'm Maddie Salomone. I'm a lawyer and athlete advocate, and I was also a collegiate lacrosse player and chaired the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee to the NCAA, or National SAC, while I was in school. In this episode, we're going to discuss the NCAA's proposed new constitution. I'll give you a little background, explain what's in it and what's changed, and share my thoughts and what it kind of means moving forward. Before I continue, I want to take a minute to recognize our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Anchor. If you haven't heard of Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. It's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. So, to give you a little background, on July 30th, following the Alston decision that happened the month prior, the NCAA announced that it would be putting together a committee to basically do a complete overhaul of its governance, look at its constitution, and come up with a proposed new constitution that would effectively give the NCAA a much smaller role in college sports. And I'll get into the reason behind this. But if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've no doubt heard me talk about the last time that the NCAA decided to take a look at its governance structure and make some big changes. And that took place while I was chair of the Division I Student Athlete Advisory Committee. So I was heavily involved in discussions about what the new structure should look like at that point, and was extremely disappointed in the results. So full disclosure, I have very little confidence in the NCAA's ability to look at itself and make these decisions, not only from a pure place, but in the way that it really needs to be done and in a way that benefits athletes. And even this decision, this is in response to the Supreme Court decision in Alston. And it's because they basically want to avoid liability legally by shifting the power around and playing all sorts of games in terms of who's in control of what. And I will get into that. But make no mistake about what this is. This is all in an effort to protect the NCAA. This isn't about making things better for athletes. It's not about making things better for schools and conferences. This is to shield the NCAA from further liability under antitrust scrutiny, and we'll look a little closer at what's going on with some of the language in this proposed new constitution and what that likely means moving forward. But so going back to the previously when they did this a few years ago, and this is not the first time either. I mean, I came across an article, I think from 1993. They were talking about the same things about looking at their values and deciding, that they wanted to eliminate a lot of the rules and streamline things and make things simple. They've never accomplished that. The rule book continues to grow. It's over 400 pages, and then that includes the current constitution, which is 43 pages, and the bylaws, which make up the rest. But at the time of the restructuring in 2014, that was in response to heavy media pressure that came as a result of O'Bannon, which specifically dealt with name, image, and likeness, which is obviously a theme now. There was also Northwestern football players trying to unionize. The NCPA even flew a banner over the convention center that year in further demonstration of the fact that athletes don't have rights under the structure. And it was also kind of on the tail end of the extraordinary punishments that the NCAA doled out to Penn State after the criminal investigation into Jerry Sandusky, which many felt was an overreach. And, there's an outcry about essentially the death penalties that the NCAA would hand out to institutions inconsistently. And in the case of Penn State, it wasn't even anything in violation of actual association rules. It was a criminal matter. And like so many other punishments that the NCAA doles out, it didn't really punish any of the people involved. It effectively punished the athletes who had committed to play in the school. It punished future athletes. They were for a time unable to participate in championships and other things. And it went too far, in my opinion. And, I was chair of SAC at the time. We weren't allowed to talk about it, which is wild when you think about it, because what issue is really more central to athletes, but, how they are treated when punishments are doled out and other things. But I digress. At the time, also, there were a number of reports about players not having enough money to buy food. I think there was a documentary that had even come out at that time, while coaches obviously made millions of dollars. And these are not new themes, but it was really one of the first times that it felt like the public was finally starting to turn on the NCAA, because a lot had come out. And I think for a while, obviously, there have been many advocates for years on these issues, but they largely come from people within the structure who athletes, people who have seen the wrongs. But from a public perspective, many people don't really know what goes on within the NCAA. And that's even clear when you look at stuff that politicians try to do when it comes to the rules. There's a fundamental lack of understanding. And I think at the time there was still this idea that these athletes are given so much, they're pampered, they're this, they're that. And I think the truth has started to come out more and more as people have been able to vocalize what really goes on. But at the time, that was a big turning point. And like so many things, the NCAA immediately made it about trying to be better as an organization. And honestly, nothing really came out of it. There were a few things. Athletes ended up getting a vote, but it was so nominal. And I've talked about that story. But anyway, when I heard that, now the NCAA was deciding to look at its governance structure and relook at its constitution, all I could think was, well, of course they are. That's what they do every time there is an image problem and they're in serious trouble and are falling out of public favor. They have to do something that seems drastic. But when you really dig into what goes on, nothing much changes. And so, I'll say it right now, I would not be shocked if, and I think we're seeing it already, if the NCAA continues to try and cling on to as much power as possible while acting like it's really shirking a lot of its responsibilities and putting it, in the hands of the conferences and the institutions. And I will, of course, get into that because there is language that suggests that. But perhaps more interestingly is the language that is creating a distinction between the divisions and saying, okay, now it's not the NCAA, now it's each of the divisions is actually going to create the bylaws and they are going to enforce these standards. Now, I think that is a huge problem. I don't think they can get away with that because I think that is essentially what exists already. I fail to see the distinction. The divisions are already governed separately. They already have their separate rules and they basically come from the NCAA. So that is just playing around with the language. If they want to put it in the hands of the conferences and institutions, that's one thing. But to say that the divisions are now the ones that are going to monitor that, well, who's overseeing the divisions are controlled at the NCAA level, let's be honest. And there are very few times in which the divisions are really acting collectively. Typically, when they're making the rules, it's entirely separate. So the way this is written, honestly, is really, to me, a game. The way it reads to me is the NCAA is trying to pretend that, before it was the NCAA making the rules and now it's the divisions making the rules. And that's completely ridiculous because the divisions vote separately on their rules already. That's the way that it works. There are very few issues where all the divisions come together and vote on rules. Typically speaking, it is already broken down by the rules of Division I, the rules of Division II, and the rules of Division III. And so to say differently is, to me, absurd. And I don't think that really fixes the antitrust problem. I think you fix it by breaking it down to the conferences and institutions and giving them the power to oversee these things. But if it's coming from in any way a national body, which divisions would still be. I don't think that fixes the problem. And I think it's just a sneaky way of the NCAA retaining oversight and continuing to really be in charge of the rules. So I just don't buy it. When the NCAA is pretending to take a back seat, I think they're still staying in it. And I think that's even anticipated when you hear from people within leadership at the NCAA, because they're already anticipating the conferences not really wanting to take over everything, like enforcement and interpretation of rules. Now, of course, this time, once again, name, image, and likeness played a central role, and there is increasing discussion of pay for play. But again, the biggest difference this time is that the NCAA had to make certain changes that it should have made a long time ago, because if it didn't, the Alston decision made clear that it would be open up, to further scrutiny under antitrust, and, it would be obliterated, essentially in court. And to explain the issue that the NCAA is sort of facing in court under antitrust, one of the biggest issues for the NCAA is the fact that the NCAA is the only show in town when it comes to college sports. So when it creates rules at the national level that have financial implications, it severely limits competition in a way that hurts athletes, essentially, because they are then being compensated through scholarships and other benefits at a rate that is below what their true value is if schools were just allowed to provide, think about unlimited scholarships or unlimited benefits, whatever. Because again, the amount that schools can provide is capped, and on many teams, all teams, the number of scholarships even is capped. So the amount that schools are required to pay out for athletes is already limited, and athletes have no ability to negotiate. They also have nowhere else to go, basically, because they're going to go to a school that is within the confines of the NCAA if they want to play college sports. And every conference and every school has to follow these specific rules. So it doesn't allow for the competition that is favorable under antitrust and that what we want, because it ultimately leads to better, more optimal outcomes, more efficient outcomes when it comes to finances, which in this case would mean that the price of a scholarship is closer to what an institution is actually willing to pay, rather than athletes being undercompensated. So by putting it back down to the conference level, you would enable athletes to basically choose between conferences who would, in theory, be competing to get the best athletes. And so it would naturally create a sense of competition that would lead to more optimal rules for athletes, because, the conferences are going to want to attract athletes. And if they have really rigid rules where not a lot of scholarships can be provided, then an athlete is simply going to choose a conference where they will be compensated in different ways through scholarships and other benefits. And another point worth mentioning is the fact that conferences have always had the ability to set stricter standards with regard to most of the rules. But as in the case of scholarships, they couldn't, as a conference, decide to offer more scholarships or set the cap higher, or add extra benefits. And in the case of a lot of the rules, it's been a way for schools and conferences to get away with not spending what they're capable of spending and enabling them to essentially save money that they can put to other things, including coaches' salaries. And just to be abundantly clear, this is absolutely not something that the NCAA wanted to do. And it may not even be something that the conferences particularly want, because again, they are going to lose some of that insulation from criticism for rules that they create. Without someone else to blame, because it has been a mutually beneficial relationship between schools and conferences and the NCAA. That said, they can't do it anymore. Alston made that clear. And at least if the conferences compete, then it will drive more of the rules to be more favorable to athletes, because they're ultimately trying to entice athletes to come to their schools. So they don't want to set super rigid rules that are unappealing to athletes. And really, a lot of these rules come from an effort to kind of control competition and oftentimes to sort of level the playing field. But the truth is that the lower tier Division I schools are really never competing for the same athletes as the Power 5 conferences. Because there are so many more reasons why those athletes are choosing those schools. The money is one thing for sure, but the competition and the notoriety and the other things that the school offers. And it's not to say that no athlete ever chooses those other schools for another reason, but generally speaking, if they have the option to go Power 5, that's where they're going to go. The other part of the problem is when you are setting national rules, right? There's no way to actually effectively regulate every single school within Division I. It just can't happen. It's not efficient, for starters. But then there are specific needs within each conference. You see that at the Ivy League. And you see that within the Power 5s compared to the lower tiers, where they're dealing with different resources, they're dealing with different problems. Rather than try to control exactly how the schools spend money, and really what it means is when they are creating rules, a lot of the times the rules actually are targeted in ways that prevent schools from spending money on athletes. So what does that mean? It means that if you're restricted from spending money on athletes, but you're making a ton of money, the money's got to go somewhere, because also the business model in college sports is so flawed, because they're technically nonprofits. So they just spend all of the money that they make every year in the most horrible system ever created in many respects. And it makes no sense. And then they cry poor and they act like they're not making money. And, there are athletic departments that do contribute a certain amount of funds back to the universities and back to the library, and that's all well and good. And that's the way that it should work. But it's also then again, it's disingenuous to say that there isn't it's not a mutually beneficial relationship between the athletic department and the school. Part of bringing in other students is also having things that the students can do, i.e. sports, i.e. 100 other things, but sports being a big driver in the, college athletic, or in the college experience for everybody at the university, not just the athletes. But I digress. But I think that even with NIL, and I'll make this point because, there's been a lot of discussion about, should we have a federal rule? Should there be a national standard for what NIL is and how it functions? And I think that there are valid arguments in favor of it. And I think to the degree that there ever is a federal piece of legislation, it should be very bare bones, and it should absolutely not go into the weeds of anything other than NIL. And again, it's not because I don't think there are tons of things to fix within the NCAA. There absolutely are. But you can easily come up with a piece of legislation that can be bipartisan, and make sense, and, create some standard that, schools and conferences can't fall below, basically. It should be very athlete protective. But past that, I actually think it makes more sense for the conferences to come up with rules. It's federated that way. It makes a lot more sense than the state laws, because within each state, you have schools within different conferences, different divisions, and it's just like it's hard to set a national standard, even for all of Division I. It's hard to set like a state standard for all the schools with different needs. So it makes sense for the conferences to decide what they stand for and how they choose to compete. And you can look outside of NIL. The Ivy League does not allow for out-of-season competition. It also allows for athletes to participate in multiple sports, which can be appealing for some. They also don't offer athletically related scholarships. So they've made that choice as a conference that they are primarily focused on academics. And it's one of the reasons why I laugh every time there's this discussion about needing to set national standards on academics for institutions. That's always been a conference and an institution choice. And I made that point as an athlete every time we would discuss these academic standards. And I would say this should be pushed back on the schools and the conferences. They need to decide if they really want to be an institution with integrity, or if they're just willing to kind of waive their standards, make up classes along the way, and do who they choose to accept. And I think, and how they're willing to set up their athletes for success or failure based on how they do those things. But to have, again, even a national standard on some of that is sort of ridiculous. And it's not like it's really enforced, because it's still up to the institutions to uphold certain of those standards. But anyway, I think that there is a lot at this point, compared to several months ago. I think schools are now kind of liking the fact that they can be more competitive and they can be more creative, and they have the autonomy finally to create programs that are beneficial to their athletes and that are helping them get on NIL deals and take advantage of certain things. Now, obviously, there is a need to monitor a little bit more how those resources are being devoted to male versus female athletes, and amongst sports in general, because I think you've seen a lot of the education, a lot of the attention focused on basketball and football, which is not a shock. But in the world of Title IX, which exists in college sports because all these schools accept federal money on some level, those resources need to be devoted equitably. So if the football athletes are being given certain training on NIL, or are allowed to use the marks of the universities, or various other things that put them at an advantage, they have to allow the same across gender. So that's going to be one of the next sort of things that I think we see with NIL in particular that is going to need to be looked at. And it's going to need to be looked at, based on the third parties that are dealing with these institutions. And the last thing I'll mention as well is to, just more to reiterate the fact that this is still an interim policy, right? There's no federal standard, and the NCAA has not gotten it together to figure out what anything is going to look like. And it seems like it's going to be pushed to conferences and schools anyway. But, bear in mind that the way that things are right now is not necessarily the way things will look in terms of NIL. And again, I've said it 100 million times. I never count the NCAA out. Even recently I was listening to a keynote speech by an EVP at the NCAA, and he was talking about the fact that the NCAA has an office in DC where they put a lot of effort into their lobbying, and oftentimes at the behest of conferences and schools. So, the NCAA has not totally eliminated the rules on NIL. They're still technically on the books. Kind of like, laws that governments are too lazy to remove, except these ones, in theory, could be enforced again. Though, of course, I think they will look a lot different. And that's even clear from the Constitution, the proposed Constitution. But anyway, getting back to the Constitution specifically, I want to address kind of the way that this has been presented. And I can't help myself, but look at a misstatement, to say the least, that was made in the memo that went out from the NCAA Constitution Committee chair. And I have to laugh, because it's part and parcel of how the NCAA kind of always presents its information. But in the memo, he states that this new proposed Constitution is about 1/4 the length of the current Constitution. Now, I am a bit of a numbers geek, and so I was troubled when I looked at the actual numbers, because the current Constitution is 43 pages. The proposed Constitution is 18 and a half pages. And I'm sorry, but that is not 1/4 the length of the current Constitution. It's actually closer to 1/2 the length, even than it is to 1/3 the length. And to be more precise, the new Constitution is 43% the length of the old one. So again, closer to 1/2 than even 1/3. But the NCAA is trying to tell us that it's 1/4 the length. Obviously, this is a very minor point, but I find it comical, because it seems that no matter what the NCAA is presenting, there's always some sort of spin that makes it seem like what they've done is so much more remarkable and favorable to them. Anyway, getting back on task, the truth about the whole thing is that the length of the Constitution doesn't really matter at all, because whether it's ratified by the membership as is or not, and they have until December 15th to propose any new changes, that's still just the Constitution, which doesn't include any of the bylaws, which again are closer to 400 pages in length. And that won't be addressed until this Constitution is approved by a one institution, one vote, and one conference, one vote on January 20th, 2022. At that point, each of the divisions will look at the rules and make any major changes between January and August 2022. And even the EVP of the NCAA doesn't think that it's reasonable to think that these rules will be fully fleshed out by then. And I would agree with him, because I've seen how that works, and I've seen the reticence of so many to eliminate rules that they've, that they feel are so important, that even when they talk about waivers are made to this rule every day, they still want to keep on the books because it's like the fabric of their existence. And, again, also August, we're looking then at the beginning of another school year. So you're talking about if any changes are made, then schools are immediately in a position of having to adjust to whatever they are. And that's a very difficult thing. I think then to go back to NIL, the way that it was sort of dumped on schools, whether or not there was forewarning, the way that the NCAA went about it and went from, okay, we're coming up with an idea for all of you schools and some guidance, to no, free for all, figure it out. That's stressful. And that's, an area where there's then maybe more people and resources that they actually need to make sure that they're abiding by whatever the rules are. So, difficult position to be in. It's why the old, I guess in the current legislative cycle, having rules voted in January and going through final modifications makes more sense, because at least then there's time for people to be aware of what, is kind of coming down. But again, dumping it in August, I think that's a lot. And, also because this may constitute such a massive change, and we will go into some more of the specifics of the proposed Constitution, because it delegates more of the responsibility to conferences and institutions, the NCAA is already anticipating having a transition committee, which means that the NCAA is still heavily influencing everything. And again, the NCAA's EVP, who gave a keynote at a symposium that I was part of, doesn't really think that the conferences are going to want to regulate and take over control of certain things, including what constitutes education-related expenses, and kind of anticipates some things being pushed back up to the national level. And I'm actually inclined to agree with him, due largely to the fact that the relationship that the NCAA and membership has had for a long time has worked really well for both parties, except the athletes, because no one is ultimately forced to take responsibility. In the past, whenever people have had an issue with something that the conferences or the institutions do, those conferences and institutions just point their finger back to the NCAA to say, well, it's not our fault. These are the rules. We have to follow them. And likewise, whenever the NCAA is criticized, they always say something to the effect of, well, our hands are tied because the members make all the rules and there's nothing we can do. Now, all of this is completely disingenuous, obviously, and the NCAA has always had more power than it pretends. And we need look no further than what Mark Emmert did at the 11th hour with NIL. After months of saying that he can't do anything without the schools deciding, well, lo and behold, he dictates to them that they need to establish rules for NIL at the institutional and conference levels, because the NCAA will not be enforcing the NIL rules indefinitely that the membership voted on, pending further legislation. And again, that left schools in a position, in a really bad position because they really weren't prepared for that. Whether they should have been or not, they were not. All right. So again, I've given you a bunch of the background and obviously pontificated a lot. But to go into the specifics a little bit, to start with, the proposed new constitution now begins with a preamble, which it did not contain before at all, that states the NCAA, a voluntary, self-governing organization of four-year colleges, universities, and conferences committed to the well-being and development of student athletes, to sound academic standards and the academic success of student athletes, and to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, I find that first sentence to be interesting because of the fact that it emphasizes that the NCAA is voluntary and self-governing. And that's an important signal because the NCAA kind of made that argument in court where they were saying, well, nobody's forced to be part of the NCAA and all this stuff, and it was ultimately getting a competition. But the truth of the matter is that if the schools are not part of the NCAA, there's nowhere else for them to be. So effectively, they absolutely control the marketplace of college sports because there isn't another option if members object to some of the things that they do. Now, the prior constitution didn't really do that at all. Instead, it emphasized the association and that the members must follow association rules. So this is a big shift to say, well, you're not forced to be here, and ultimately you guys are the ones that make the rules, and not even really saying that we enforce them. Again, because how much of the NCAA argued in court that members were free to leave, it is very telling that the NCAA is kind of setting itself up already, trying to insulate itself from any further criticism in terms of how the rules are made and what its ultimate control is. Now, the preamble also emphasizes that sports are a, quote, vital co-curricular part of the athlete's educational experience. And it emphasizes that member schools and conferences, rather than the NCAA, are to maintain institutional control of and responsibility for the athletic programs. And it goes on to say the basic purpose of the association is to support and promote healthy and safe intercollegiate athletics, including national championships, as an integral part of the educational program, and the student athlete as an integral part of the student body. And basically, if you followed any of the arguments the NCAA has made in court, this reads exactly like those. Now, also, by looking at the preamble, most of the bylaws should be completely eliminated, in my mind, because they no longer seem to fall under the purview of the NCAA and should seemingly be delegated to the conferences and institutions, as it's kind of trying to do. And of course, like going back to my days as chair, that was something that I consistently would vocalize in meetings and say, if you want to decrease the size of the rule book, it makes more sense to put the autonomy in the hands of the conferences, in the hands of the schools. Why on earth are you trying to control these broad concepts that are ineffective and just make the rule book completely complicated? And again, I point out the fact that it was impossible to set rules for all of Division I when you had the Power Fives and then the lower tier Division I schools and different mindsets within, the conferences themselves. But there was always such a resistance to deregulating that, even the result of the rules working group that I sat on for a year, which was tasked with decreasing the size of the rule book, failed to eliminate any rules at all. Like it didn't accomplish anything. And back then, though, there was no impetus for it to do anything because we didn't have Alston, essentially forcing the NCAA to do exactly that with many of the rules, especially those with financial implications, to, again, push it to the conferences so that there is an idea that there's some competition amongst, that is benefiting ultimately the consumer, the marketplace, what have you. Now, an example of something that I've always felt belonged at the conference level were the rules around scholarships. The scholarship limitations to me are absolutely absurd, especially given how many schools can easily afford to provide full scholarships to all of their athletes. And it's ridiculous that equivalency sports have scholarship caps that amount to less than half of their rosters. And for those of you who maybe don't understand how that works, that doesn't mean that, if you have 11 scholarships for the team, that 11 athletes are on full scholarship. Most of the time, it means maybe 1 or 2 or 3 might be on full scholarship, but everybody else then is at like a 50% scholarship, a 40% scholarship, an 80% scholarship. And, some people are just getting books and maybe room and board. So when you talk about the equivalency sports, it essentially means that, all the star athletes are not necessarily on full scholarships. And sometimes the coaches go based on need on the team. So if your athlete comes from a family that really can't afford the school, they might offer more to that athlete than they will to an athlete who they maybe even want more, but their family can maybe afford to pay for it a little bit more. So again, as a result of these scholarship caps, the inefficiency is that the schools that can afford to provide all the scholarships to all the athletes because they have the revenue, they end up spending money on frivolous things rather than helping cover the costs of the expenses of their athletes' education, which is apparently one of the NCAA's stated main purposes is education. I mean, how many times do we hear about the educational benefits of playing a sport? And it's not even that I disagree. I think that everything in life is an educational experience. I think not going to college is an educational experience. But if you're pretending that your main purpose is to ensure that athletes receive a college education, and I think that should maybe be the emphasis, is you're getting an institutional education through your scholarship, then there should be so many more rules that actually allow for that and allow for athletes to take full advantage of those educational experiences within their institution. But we're not going to go down that train. I can't help but mention that as we're talking about this. Now, as you might imagine, this proposed constitution is ripe with ideals and basically zero specifics, which is to be expected from a constitution. I mean, it's not supposed to be the bylaws. But as a skeptic and someone who knows how the NCAA operates, I don't necessarily buy the sincerity of any of these platitudes until I see the specifics in action. Because frankly, a lot of the things that are within this Constitution are not new. They may be stated in a slightly different way, but they basically existed in the 43-page Constitution. We shouldn't assume that just because they made it shorter that they got rid of things. They just said it more succinctly, which again is very possible in the rule book. You could make a very simple rule book if you just got rid of all the extra verbiage that can only be interpreted by someone who's super familiar with all the bylaws and how they connect and what else you need to look at to make sure you know all the rules and overcomplicate it. Anywho, the fact is every time the NCAA is in hot water, it announces a plan to look at restructuring its governance and changing rules, and then gets away with doing nothing because people stop paying attention and they hear what the NCAA comes out with and, think it's great. And again, I can say that having been part of it from 2012 to 2014, I spent so much time traveling to NCAA headquarters, being on conference calls, talking with people, trying to create a new governance structure and rules that were going to be beneficial to athletes. Of course, as I've mentioned before, athletes were completely left off of this proposed new governance structure. And that, basically prompted me as chair of NCAA to have to stand up and call them out on it. and demand that athletes are included at every level of the governance structure and that we had a vote. Because at the time that I was chair, we didn't have a vote. And we were being told over and over again, like, no, you actually have more power as athletes without having the vote, which was nonsense. And now what I find interesting is that they're actually finally, for the first time, potentially going to give athletes a vote on the new board, which is also being decreased from 21 members to 9. They're thinking that's going to make it more efficient. I don't know that it's going to make it more efficient. In some ways, I see that then as like 9 people who have a hard enough time making decisions, because most of the time that's presidents of universities. And I think they're always cautious to totally come in and make a lot of changes within athletics. And maybe that's starting to shift a little bit, but I think it'll be interesting, number one, if that goes through, and then number two, if that does in fact help with efficiency at the structural level. I just see this as a lot of lip service until I see actual rules in place, actual policies in place that are doing the things that they claim are important to the association. But they often don't do that, and often there's a lot of suggestions and suggested policies and recommendations that have no teeth. So there's no enforcement of anything that actually benefits athletes or protects them. It's just, you should do things that are, make sure that you're treating your athletes well and you're not abusing them, but we're not going to oversee that. So again, there is more pressure this time because the NCAA is ultimately trying to avoid issues with antitrust while still clinging to its idea of amateurism by emphasizing that there is to be no pay for play, which is the NCAA's new line between professional and college sports, because it's blurred every other line that it's ever had over the years. And personally, and this is not an endorsement for pay for play, but I think the true marker between college sports and professional sports is that college athletes are students of the universities for which they play, and professional athletes are not, period. Regardless of how much money they may be able to make on NIL or anything else, including pay for play, that's the line. And, I think it's really interesting because I think it's been pointed out that the NCAA is not talking about amateurism within its new constitution, but it absolutely is in every other way. I mean, it's talking about the college model. Well, the college model means athletes don't get paid to play their sport. So they're not letting go of that, and they're finding new, more clever ways of saying exactly the same thing. And we know that the NCAA is very good at that because they invented the term student athlete to continue to avoid having to pay for lifelong debilitating injuries that athletes sustain while playing their sports in college. And that includes a case that was concluded fairly recently that denied benefits to an athlete who sustained, lifelong debilitating injuries. He's paralyzed from the neck down as a result of playing in a football game, and obviously incurring numerous expenses, because I think this was in the 70s this happened. He ultimately lost his case. So he has not only had to deal with the fact that his life changed, but then the expense of that. And, and that's one example of ways that the NCAA is not doing things that benefit athletes. And it's not devoting funds in ways that benefit athletes. It's paying for legal fees that fight them in court. Millions every single year. And, and that's not benefiting anybody. Now, again, the thing about this Constitution is it all sounds well and good. I mean, you read some of this and it's like, oh, you believe in diversity. You think that gender equity is important. You think that athletes should be protected. But it means absolutely nothing without some rules and policies that back that up. Back up what they claim to be committing to do for athletes. And to me, it's just a necessary step that the NCAA has to avoid future legal liability. And all of the language about giving the schools and conferences power is exactly that. Make no mistake about this, because I don't actually believe that the NCAA wants to give up its power or that it in practice may actually be doing that, because I think it's still going to try to quote unquote, help the conferences and the schools enforce things that are too complicated for the conferences to figure out on their own, like how to define what education related expenses are and how to enforce things. And again, I think there's a little truth to that, because I think that it's going to put conferences and schools in a position where if someone complains about a policy, they can't just pass the buck up, right? They're going to have to they're going to have to answer why they have a certain policy that isn't good for athletes or that isn't good for some other reason. And they're maybe going to have to adjust and make things that are actually better. So I see more rulemaking power in the hands of conferences and schools to be a good thing, because they own that responsibility of what rules they create, and they have to answer to it. Now, as I mentioned, many of the principles are not new at all, but the NCAA has never managed to institute effective policies that accomplish any of it, including and especially gender equity. Because again, if you read through the current, Constitution, it says basically all of these things just with more words. And maybe not words that are as clever, but the NCAA has always claimed to exist to protect player health and safety, and has touted the fact that it promotes gender equity and inclusion, and, but it's never actually done those things. And it's never taken on the responsibility to accomplish those things. What they do is kind of create best practices, but they're not rules. So nothing is dictating to the schools, you must do this, including with a lot of the concussion stuff and various other mental health things. Like, they put out this material that says, well, it'd be great if you had a mental health professional on your campus and yada, yada, yada. But there's no requirement. There's no enforcement. And more appallingly, is really when there are situations with athlete abuse. Because make no mistake about this, the NCAA emphasizes institutional control so that it has no legal duty to protect athletes from abusive coaches and the like, because it shirks all of that responsibility. And anytime that it has been sued, it claims to have no legal duty to oversee abusive coaches, and further states that it collects no data on such issues, it doesn't oversee it, it doesn't monitor the coaches, it has no idea basically what happens on campus. Like, that's for the institutions. And more than that, like, it claims to have no idea that these things go on at the rate that they do, which is crazy to me. And it's flat out irresponsible, especially based on the stories that have been made public in recent years. And I emphasize the ones that have been made public because there are far more that have not. And I can say that as someone who was an athlete and who continues to be made aware of the ongoing issues through my work. And there should be a public outcry for the NCAA to begin monitoring coaches' behavior and complaints by athletes of all kinds, because schools have a proven track record of covering negative stories up. And for the NCAA to continue to pretend that it is unaware that these things go on at the rate that they do is absolutely ridiculous. And quite frankly, I think the NCAA can be considered on notice of all of these issues, and further, that their stated commitment to the health and well-being of athletes should invoke a legal duty. Like, what are they there for? Their stated purpose and reason for existence is the health and safety of athletes, but it doesn't monitor its athletes. It doesn't monitor the coaches that impact the athletes. It doesn't actually oversee the institutions on that issue. It oversees them on everything else, everything that's not really that important, the rules concerning competition, academics, what have you. But it doesn't look at, are these players actually being taken care of? Is there mental health being taken care of? Is their physical health a concern? Like, are they being protected? Are the trainers on staff, are they doing their jobs? Are coaches throwing injured athletes out into competition? Those are things that matter. They're very important. They should be things that are highly regulated and monitored by the NCAA. If there was anything that they controlled, it should be these issues, because the schools can't be trusted to do that. And I'll mention another interesting aspect of this is that the Constitution actually emphasizes the divisions as overseeing the infractions at this point. And, I think there are a lot of questions about what that will look like. And again, what they're going to take control of. Are they going to start monitoring coaches this way? They should, they need to, but I guess we'll see what happens. I want to address also the financial piece of this Constitution, because this proposed Constitution basically reaffirms existing revenue allocations and championship opportunities for each division, and goes on to say that it assures each division has oversight of its own budget, expenditures, and revenue distribution to its members. And in addition, which is not a change, Division 2 will receive 4.37%, and Division 3 will receive 3.18% of all operating revenue sources. And I actually think that some Division 1 schools should be included in that, so that they can be in a financial position to provide benefits to athletes in the form of mental health services and other requirements to keep athletes healthy and safe. Because there are schools within Division 1 that have the resources, but then there are ones that really need help. And there's no reason why a good portion of the funds, the revenue that the NCAA brings in every year, there's no reason why that shouldn't be going back to the schools to cover those things that are directly impacting athlete health and safety, and would do a lot to help that situation. Because so many of the times, it just shouldn't be an excuse that they're like, financial constraints should not be an excuse for schools not to provide those resources, because those resources exist within the NCAA. Maybe not at the individual institutions, but again, what else is the NCAA there for but to provide those resources? So these excuses should never be made at an association-wide level, because there aren't the financial constraints that may exist at an institutional level certainly do not exist at a national level. And again, that's what those funds are there for. Give them to the schools that need them to help protect their athletes and provide them with the resources that they need on all sorts of things, because we're talking about $1 billion in revenue each year. There is money in the NCAA, and it needs to go to athletes in one form or another, not to pad the pockets of the people in charge. And also, I think there's also then room to be creative, right? So schools can find ways to be more cost efficient. And I actually mentioned this during a panel discussion last week, but there are all sorts of ways of providing resources that don't necessarily involve hiring a full-time staff member, because that does obviously come with additional expenses and benefits and all that stuff. But, one area, for instance, is one of the benefits of COVID was that telehealth made a lot of services more accessible. And to save money, schools could be looking into that, like into some sort of subscription service to cover the costs of their athletes' mental health. And that has the added benefit of allowing athletes to choose someone with whom they're comfortable in a more confidential capacity than is often the case with, the sports psychologists hired by the school, who unfortunately a lot of times actually share athlete information with the coaches, which obviously is in violation of all sorts of codes of confidentiality and ethics, and they shouldn't do it, but it happens. And, and on top of that, like, I think there's not every athlete, there's still a stigma when it comes to that stuff. And I think there's been a lot done to kind of curtail it, but there's a difference between being able to access someone you chose yourself in a location that, maybe people aren't aware when you walk in that that's what you're doing. But when you are going into an athlete building and everybody knows where the sports psychologist is and you're walking down the hall, like, people, not everybody wants to be seen doing that stuff. And, and that should be respected. But the proposed constitution also references a commitment to diversity and inclusion, which says exactly what you would expect it to say and is predictably vague. And actually, Athlete Ally and the Human Rights Campaign wrote an open letter calling out the NCAA for the lack of specifics. But what I will say about that is that while I agree that the Constitution absolutely lacks specifics, I also don't necessarily think that that's the place for an enumerated policy that they're kind of calling for in their letter for, gender and sexual orientation, discrimination, etc. But I absolutely think that they should continue to ride the NCAA and ensure that those policies are actually put in place and enforced to protect athletes. And certainly the NCAA needs to put more money where its mouth is when it comes to the discrepancies between, treatment of and expenditures on male and female athletes, especially after pretending that it has been unaware for all these years that there has always been a gross discrepancy between male and female athletes at its own championships. And that to me was one of the most outrageous lies the NCAA ever told. Because anyone with eyes for all of these years could see the discrepancies without having to even go behind the scenes to see the lackluster gyms that the female athletes had access to. They could look at the gifts that the athletes were given during these championships. They could look at anything, the transportation to and from, what have you. The NCAA just was never called out as publicly before. And so thank you, Twitter, and the video capabilities and the guts, I think, of some of these athletes who have seen the impact that their voice can have, especially during COVID. And again, I think that female athletes have gotten so fed up with the blatant discrepancies that are like repeatedly broadcast during these championship events and these media packages where you see the glitz of the glamour and everything that's going on behind the scenes. And you're kind of sitting there as a female athlete going, so all those resources are going to the guys. You must value us a ton. Anyway, I think this document should really be taken as the NCAA's effort to avoid legal liability. And I think it is very telling, and it kind of signals the direction that they're thinking to accomplish that. But I would encourage people to hold their feet to the fire and to encourage more accountability on behalf of the NCAA. It's all well and good for them to give the rulemaking authority to the conferences, but they should be overseeing the things that relate to athlete health and safety, and they should be enforcing it. And it should be serious. There should be serious, if there were ever a place for serious penalties for violating rules, it belongs in rules that address athlete abuse and mistreatment and the sorts of things that can really impact an athlete for the rest of their lives. But this podcast is already kind of long, so I will end it here. And I will continue to kind of update once there is a more finalized version of the Constitution to go a little bit more in the weeds. But I think you get the idea. There weren't these massive changes, and they were predictable, some of the things that did change, including an emphasis on athletes being able to profit off of NIL, but not be paid to play. So I'll leave it here. I appreciate you listening. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can follow the link in the podcast description. And that is much appreciated. And until next time.